Hey everyone, welcome back. In the last lesson, we added our vehicle's API and we're pulling down the vehicle's information. In this lesson, what we need to do is take into account whether the character has multiple vehicles. Okay, so we need to make our previous and next buttons work. First up though, let's go ahead and fix these labels up here. And I think I'm just going to change manufacturer to maker, just because manufacturer is way too long for this little view here. So let's go to our storyboard and let's come in here to our manufacturer. I'm gonna need to remove our width constraint. Then let's change this to just maker maybe, or yeah, maker's fine. And then we will re-add our width constraint. There we go, that looks good. And then for these ones up here that were pretty long, let's go ahead and add auto shrink to these. So let's say auto shrink, minimum font scale, and same for these ones right here. I think the other ones will be fine. Those are just numbers. All right, so we'll change those three. All right, that looks good. The other thing that I want to do to save us some time, instead of clicking on random until we finally get someone that has some vehicles, let's go ahead and come over here to our person API. And instead of using the random number that is passed in, I'm just going to hard code this to 1, and that will give us the results for Luke. Let's go ahead and test that. All right, so every time I click on random, we should get Luke Skywalker. There we go. And we're doing that because we know that he has multiple vehicles and multiple starships as well. We haven't gotten to starships yet though. But yeah, I think that's looking good. I think that auto shrink is working well for us. All right, so let's figure out how we want our previous and next buttons to work. Remember, we could have multiple vehicle URLs. And so we're gonna start out with the URL at index 0. And if there are more than that, then we're going to make the next button enabled. And when we click on it, we are going to refetch. Let me get back into our vehicles VC here. We are going to recall our getVehicle function, which will go and get the information for the next URL and then set up the views for that, okay? So we need to keep track of which URL we are on, which index in our vehicles array. So let's go ahead and say var current vehicle is equal to 0. We'll start out at 0. And then just to start out, so we can kind of get an idea of what we're going to be doing here, on the previous clicked, we are going to say current vehicle minus equal 1, okay? And let's go ahead and print out current vehicle. And then over here, let's say current vehicle. So this is the next. We're going to say plus equal 1. And then we're going to say print, let's see here, current vehicle. And then let's also print, you know what, let's not print the current vehicle. Let's print out the URL at that location. So vehicles at current vehicle and vehicles at current vehicle. Now we're gonna have to be careful or else we might get an index out of bounds crash, but we'll just be careful here because we only have 2 URLs in our array with Luke. All right, so let's say random and let's jump over here. And now let's drag this up a little bit. All right, let's say next, and we should see printed out vehicle /30. And then if we go next, we see printed out vehicle /14. All right, and so we can go back and forth between these two, but if I go too far, if I go to the next, we'll get a crash because we went up to vehicles at index 2, which is out of bounds since there are only 2 URLs in the array and arrays start at counting at 0. All right, so we have our URL at each of these points, but we need to make sure that that doesn't happen, that we don't go out of the indexes array. So we need to disable these buttons when there isn't a next or a previous URL for it to fetch. All right, so we're gonna make a function here called set button state. And this is going to handle whether or not the next button and the previous buttons are enabled, and will then call the getVehicle function All right, so let's come down here and let's think about this. The previous button is only ever going to be disabled if we are at current vehicle 0, or in other words, if we are at the very first vehicle URL in the array. So that's pretty simple. All we have to do is say if current vehicle is equal to 0, then the next button dot is enabled is equal to false. Else, at any other time, this should be previous button. There we go. And at any other time, no matter how many times we go forward, the previous button should always be enabled. So I'm going to say is enabled is equal to true. All right, so now what about the next button? If we are not currently on the last URL in our vehicles array, then we will enable the next button. So we're going to say if current vehicle is equal to vehicles.count -1. And remember, we do the -1 because, again, vehicles.count will give the number of items in the array, but the current vehicle is looking at the index, which will be 1 less than that. So if there are 2 URLs in the array, vehicles.count will give 2. But remember, when we are looking at the indexes, it starts at 0. So you have 0 to 1, but the count is 2. Okay, so that's why we have this -1. All right, so if that is the case, then our next button dot is enabled is equal to false because there aren't any more URLs in the array after the one that we are currently on. Otherwise, if there are more URLs in the array, then we say that next is enabled is equal to true. Now this isn't quite enough because this is only checking to see whether we are at the end of the array. We also need to make sure when we load the view controller to see if there is even more than 1. So up here in view.load is where we are going to handle that. We are going to say next button dot is enabled is equal to vehicles dot count is greater than 1. And remember, this is a shorthand way of doing it. Vehicles.count is greater than 1 is going to evaluate to true or false. Okay, so if vehicles.count is greater than 1, then this evaluates to true, and we are setting next button dot is enabled equal to true. If it evaluates to false, if there is only 1 vehicle in the URLs, then that evaluates to false, and we are setting next button dot is enabled to false. Okay. All right, so now that we have all of that, what we can do here is we can go ahead and call set button state for each of these, or for each of these buttons here. And then down here, we are going to call get vehicle URL, and the URL that we are passing in is whichever one the current vehicle is currently set on. Okay, so current vehicle, and we are accessing the URL at the index current vehicle as set by our previous and next buttons. Oh, I'm sorry, I did current vehicle here. This should be just vehicles. All right, and then the last thing we want to do before we test this out is here in our storyboard, let's go ahead and set these buttons to our fade enabled subclass, just like we had for our segue buttons over here. So let's say previous, and we'll set its custom class to fade enabled button, and next is fade enabled button, and we'll go ahead and save that, save our vehicles vc.swift file, and run this. All right, click on random, and we have Luke Skywalker as expected, and we click on vehicles. And I did forget one thing. Previous should not be currently enabled because we are starting at index 0. So if I click on this, we're going to get a crash. You see that? So we need to start out with previous button disabled. Okay, so right here by next button, I'm going to also say previous button dot is enabled is equal to false. And let's run that again. All right, I'm going to click on random. We get Luke Skywalker. and clicking on vehicles. There we go. So now previous is disabled. We can't get an index out of bounds error here. Let's click on next. And we load the second vehicle in the URLs array. Pretty cool. And then previous, as we expect, becomes active and next becomes inactive. So now we can't click next. We can only go back and forth between these two. And each time we fetch the data for that specific URL in the vehicle's URL array. All right, so that's pretty cool. Let's run through this one more time. When we load the view controller for the first time, we immediately set the previous button to be false enabled. And that's because when we start out, we're starting at 0. We don't want to go backwards and cause a crash. And next button, we do a check to see if there are more than one. If there are, then we set that to be enabled. And then when we click on previous and next, we either increment current vehicle by 1 or decrease it by 1. Okay, and that keeps track in the current vehicle. Then after we do that, we call our set button state, which sets the correct enabled state for our buttons. And then we call get vehicle on our URL vehicles array using the current vehicle index counter that we are using to keep track. All right, the last thing that I want to do here is I want to show you how we can simplify these 10 lines of code looks like into just 2. All right, so I'm going to comment that out. And what we're going to use is something new called a ternary operator. Okay, so the way to use it is you say next button dot is enabled is equal to current vehicle is equal to. Now this is an equality check, so we're saying vehicles dot count -1 question mark false colon true. Okay, and I'm going to explain this. So what we are doing here, the format for this is you have what you want to set out front, okay? And this is basically just an if-else statement simplified, okay? So you'll see here, next button dot is enabled, and then we'd have down here, next button dot is enabled is equal to, all right? So this is what you have in front. Then you have the condition that you are testing right here, okay? So as you can see here, current vehicle is equal to vehicles.count -1 is the same as the condition that we have right here, okay? So you're saying if this condition evaluates to true, then set this equal to this value, okay? So you have a syntax of a question mark after the condition, and this is the value that you want to set if it's true. Then you have a colon, and then you have the value that you want to set if this condition is not true, if it evaluates to false, okay? So try to do this for the previous button, all right? Go ahead and pause it and just follow this same syntax. You have out front what you want to be setting, then you have the condition that you are checking, then a question mark, and then the value that you want to set if your condition evaluates to true, then a colon, and the value that you want to set if your condition evaluates to false. All right, did you give that a try? Let's go ahead and do it together. So I'm going to say previous button dot is enabled is equal to, and the condition that we are trying to test is right here, current vehicle is equal to 0. If that evaluates to true, then we are going to set it to false. If it evaluates to false, then we are going to set the value to true. All right, and I'm going to leave this commented out just so you guys have reference to that in the source code. But you can see here, very much simplified. It's a little bit confusing. So if this is much more readable and clear to you, feel free to keep this as is and just kind of practice the ternary operator as well until it makes perfect sense to you. Again, it's just setting the value that you want to set. You're setting that equal to a test on the condition. So you have a condition here, and then a question mark, and then the value that you want this to be set to if your condition evaluates to true, colon, the value that you want it to set to if your condition evaluates to false. All right, and that is the end of the vehicles VC. We only have a couple more view controllers to finish up. The starships VC, which is going to be pretty much identical to this one. And then we have the films VCE. All right, so I'll see you in the next one.